Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
And you put on your seatbelts, you're ready for the drive. Okay, let's get into it. So now we've arrived at the Africa Development Bank, which was established 60 years ago to support the African economy. How well has that dream been achieved? Let's find out as we look into it. So a regional bank established to support African economies, support infrastructure development, and also the private sector. In 60 years, the African Development Bank has been able to embark on some projects to help with infrastructure in Africa. It has also embarked on other projects to support the private sector, but there have been challenges so far, and there are also prospects for the AfDB. Let's take a look at some of the challenges TC. Now, for a bank that is regional, to attend to the infrastructure needs and also the economic needs of the continent, being able to support some projects in agriculture, in energy, and so many other projects. Even some private sectors, some companies in the private sector have benefited from that, those projects. But 60 years down the line, there are still challenges because Africa still grapples with a high debt burden, and there's still lots of infrastructure deficit. And then we understand that many economies within Africa are struggling because there are challenges within the continent that has made many of the projects of the AfDB seem not to have much impact. It seems to have watered down the gains of the AfDB.
Well, I feel one of the biggest challenges the AfDB has will be the widespread poverty across Africa. And of course, the fact that it's a bank that's been set up to develop Africa. How much funds does the AfDB have?
Key question.
To, spread across the continent to meet the needs and demands of developing African nations. Now, you talk about third world nations, you talk about developing countries, you have a lot of them. A lot of these countries situated in Africa. At some point on this platform, we've talked about the fact that one country can come and want to partner with the whole of Africa, trying to provide relief aids and all that. So AfDB does have, a list of challenges, climate issues, political issues, but
fundamental.
But then I feel bulk of the problem would have to be funding because of the amount or the number of persons who are competing or who are in need of aid from the AfDB. So that would be a very key challenge. So where does the AfDB source this funds? Well, you pull strength from countries who are financially
stable,
in quotes, right? And then you also have partner agencies in European nations and the Americas and all that. But you realize that the funds are not still enough to go around to meet it's Africa developed completely.
But what can the AfDB do in spite of these challenges to ensure that, yes, African economies pick up and they actually grow? I think one of that would be to actually be a rallying point for regional trade to happen, and also to push for the regional currency, which some quarters have been pushing for Africa, because one of the reasons why we'll find that many African countries have currencies that have very less value compared to other currencies, particularly the US dollar, is the de-dollarization of the African economy, where trade wants to happen even between Nigeria and Benin Republic, for instance. The dollar seems to be the currency for trade. So if that can happen, where there's a common currency for Africa, at least the pressure on currencies in Africa would drop, and maybe that could just boost the value and help to shore up the reserves that these African countries have. So there are lots that the AfDB can actually do in spite of the challenges, even as they've been doing quite a lot. And there are prospects for them given the new talk of renewable energy, which Africa has the primary resources for. So we'll talk about all of that after this break.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
If you just joined the show, it's Early Exchange, where we shape policy and advance development. One policy to look at and how that policy will further shape development in Africa is a policy that did establish the African Development Bank. The bank has turned 60 years, and we're looking at how far, how far has it come, and how well has it done in terms of success and in terms of achievement. What are the prospects for the bank as the bank encountered challenges in trying to achieve its objective? Let's take a look at that with our analyst who's with us here in the studio. Samuel Orovwuje, who is public and international affairs analyst, is here this beautiful Tuesday morning, and he looks ready to hit the ground running. Good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. A pleasure to be here.
And we're delighted to have you. It's been a
you.
while.
Thank you.
Okay, so looking at the African Development Bank, set up primarily for the African economy to be that support and to give it the help that it needs. Over the years, with what the bank has been doing, what's your take before we even get into other issues regarding the bank? What's your first take on the AfDB?
All right, just to put things in perspective, the bank was founded in 1964 by the African Organization for African Unity, which is called the OAU, currently called the African Union. The idea of the bank was formation was to deal with core issues of development across Africa in terms of successes and prospects. The banks has done relatively well. Maybe as we progress the conversation, be able to speak to certain initiative of the bank across many African countries. On the other hand, it has some challenges, particularly from the global north, particularly in 2020, when the Donald Trump administration made an attempt to see that the current president couldn't come back as the president of the bank, but due to a lot of advocacy, a demand came through as the president. When you look at it from the external influence, particularly other members who are not part of the continent, then that challenge has always been there, where the bank is doing very well. There's what you call a kind of pull-down syndrome that comes from the West, so that the development agenda of the bank is not sustainable. But by and large, the bank has done very well in the last 60 years. And if you look at the various initiative agenda of the bank, I'm sure that in a sustainable manner, by 2063, which is one of the agenda of the bank, many development projects in Africa will have been successfully gone through in terms of providing economic growth, sustainable development, and some of their projects tied to the SDGs.
All right, so, just before now, in the opening brief, we had talked about source of funds. How do they generate the funds that they actually push to countries for purpose of development? Of course, some, just like America is world power and provide funds for certain other developing nations. I'm certain there are some other countries in Africa, like you mentioned, the AU coming together to set up the bank. Powerhouses in Africa pulling resources together, and we have over 70 billion for 3,000 projects that have been carried out in the last couple of years. But then, how do you describe the evolution of the financing model of the AfDB?
Yeah, because it's a development bank at inception. The idea, because we want to provide development, there are some key countries that had some stake in terms of the funding. The US is a stakeholder in the funding, but essentially the 54 African countries that make up the African Union currently provide fund, while Nigeria is the highest funding partner in terms of the equity funding that goes into that bank.
And you mentioned that sometimes there are influences from the West on the African Development Bank. why is the West able to influence the African Development Bank? Is it because some funding comes from the West to the African Development Bank? And if that is the case, can the African Development Bank do without funding from the West?
The structure in terms of the funding father, there was a need to speed up development in Africa. Therefore, some other countries, particularly from the West, were stakeholder in the formation, and they are still stakeholder. But in terms of percentage contribution, those percentage contributions are not as high as African country member. But then, if I answer your question correctly and understand it correctly, they have influence because they are stakeholder. The extent to those impacts on the bank's operation is a different matter at the end of the day. But what is key is that within the operational formation and the capacity and the mandate of the bank to deal with development issues, in spite of the external, they have done well relatively in the last 60 years. They will be able to speak to specific issues as we progress the conversation.
All right, so over and over again, there's this external influence from the West, and that has also led to some politicking. You mentioned something about pulling down syndrome, which is rife with the AfDB. We've also seen a resilient president in the last couple of years, holding down the AfDB. But what would you talk about the success? Without the Western influence, do you think the AfDB would have been as successful, in impacting African nations as much as, considering the track records, cleaning up 3,000 projects, the amount of funds that have been provided?
No, I think let's leave the challenges of particularly the Western conspiracy in terms of how development can be driven by Africans. So, but then if you look at the African Development Bank and look at its core initiative or agenda mandate, they have done extremely well. So maybe at this point I can speak to specific issues. They have an agenda you call the High Five, where you have different portfolio. Feed Africa, that's number one agenda of the bank, and they've done well in terms of providing investment for agricultural development in Africa. Power Africa, that's another agenda. They've done a lot of investment in trying to provide energy, electricity in Africa. The Kenya initiative of how they were able to transform the electricity penetration in Kenya to over 75% is a hallmark in terms of what the African Development Bank has done. If you talk about water and irrigation, it was a major project they did in Egypt some 2 years ago that cover a greater understanding in terms of irrigation to power agriculture in that. That's just a few examples, but as we progress, even the rural electrification project in Nigeria has been funded essentially by the African Development Bank. So in terms of successes, they are doing well, and the president is somebody that is respected within the continent and outside the continent, and he has provided the right leadership in terms of driving economic growth and development in Africa.
Now, in spite of this project that you have listed, and there are so many others that the bank has embarked upon, it doesn't. If you look around Nigeria, if you look around Africa, one would expect that without stressing too much, you could easily identify an AfDB project. Or if you go around Africa, you could easily identify an AfDB project and also see the economic impact that it is generating in wherever it is located. But sometimes it seems like these projects, some of them do not have sustainability. What could you adduce this to? Could it be the implementation? Because for any AfDB project, it also has to go through the relevant government agency of that particular country. And we know some of the issues that government agencies in Africa has in terms of accountability and actually delivering on projects to the exact amount that was earmarked for it. Could that be part of the reason why, after 60 years of the AfDB investing, supporting African economies, and in terms of infrastructure, we still look around and sometimes we're finding it hard to point at certain projects?
I think the challenge here is not about the issues of transparency and accountability. If you look at the African Development Bank projects across Africa, you can't see them standing tall. But the issue is that to what level of education the people have of this specific project. So I can tell you, as a matter of fact, that they have an inbuilt mechanism in terms of the framework, in terms of monitoring and evaluation. As most of their projects are isolated from the whims and caprices of individual countries. So most of the projects are sustainable, they are designed to be sustainable, and they have impacted Africa seriously. So if you ask me specific projects, we can speak to them and the impact that they have made within the continent. So to a very large extent, why the political configurations of individual African countries may be useful in the choice of the projects that go to those countries. But in terms of sustainability, in terms of the project timeline, in terms of the project deliverables, those projects are real and they have impacted Africa tremendously. And I can go back to the Kenya example, which is one of the bus development model within the African continent in terms of electricity and power generation that brought Kenya from about 30% in terms of energy penetration in the country to about 70-something. And that project has been impacting on that country in terms of electricity access, even if you compare it vis-a-vis the project that has come to Nigeria in recent time. So I think to a very large extent, they are isolated. But then if you look at the 60th anniversary celebration and look at the timelines and the deliverables and what they are celebrating, you find out that they have done remarkably well in terms of economic growth and development.
All right. So these projects you're mentioning, you know, in a bid to promote industrialization in Africa, do you think, you know, it could lead to a shift in Africa's economic landscape eventually in the long run? Because there are a lot of countries all in need of this attention. There are a lot of needs spread across Africa. But then you've talked about 2063 as you know, the time
of the bank
for the bank. So do you think eventually that this will translate to an improved economic landscape for Africa?
Yes, but the challenge here in terms of development, the African Development Bank is just one bank that is positioned for development projects in Africa. On the other hand, you look at the political economy of the individual African countries. To what extent do these political leaders want to develop their specific country? So in that regard, therefore, is a major challenge. The African Development Bank can just do what it has the capacity to do. But in terms of industrialization, African leadership at the continental level, that's at the African Union, have a lot of work to do. They must move away from the negative impact from the global north, particularly the West, in terms of how they shape development. So for us, we don't need to look to the United States of America, New York or Washington in particular, Beijing, London, for our development agenda. We have inbuilt mechanism within the African continent that can sustain African development. For example, the African Free Trade Agreement that was supposed to leapfrog development in Africa over 3 years now, that beautiful instrument that's supposed to energize development in Africa has not come to its fruition because of the politics and the political economy of how we're wired as a Francophone country, Anglophone, Lusophone. But we were able to remove these the shackles from the West, from our development agenda. Then there's much that can be done by the African Development. But if you put on a scale in terms of development, the African Development Bank has done extremely well. Why the political leadership need to find a way to drive the process of development in the individual country. And they are at the level of African development, African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the African Union need to drive those processes so that we can trade among us, 54 African countries, totally about 1.3 billion people. So if we're able to look inward with what the African Development Bank is doing in the high five elements that we talked about. So I just talked about three. We talked about industrialization, which is one of the elements. There are 5 elements. So maybe as we progress, we'll mention some others and how they have impacted our respective country within the continent.
Now, if we take a look at the rural electrification projects of the AfDB, particularly that in Nigeria, the concentration is not really on on-grid power solutions and solar and other renewable energy. It seemed like the AfDB is thinking into the future and going into renewable energy, which is from more investments in Nigeria and other African countries. It has been pumping a lot of money into. Now, to that aspect, which would also help industrialization, what do you think that Nigeria and other African countries need to do to enhance the development or the investment of the AfDB? If the AfDB is going along that line and doing so much in that, what should be the corresponding actions or corresponding investments of these African countries to further enhance the impact of the AfDB?
While the African Development Bank is making inroads in providing alternative energy, particularly in terms of rural electrification in Nigeria, what is important is that once we have that kind of investment from the African Development Bank, the respective or host countries equally match those investments that the African Development Bank brings to the respective country so that it can scale up those development initiative that is being sponsored by the bank. But like I mentioned earlier, some of the development are based on the equity contribution that the respective countries make to the African Development Bank. But individual countries, as it were, should be able to speed up the process of feeding Africa, the process of powering Africa, the process of industrializing Africa, the process of providing gender equity and balance as one of their initiatives as well, to see how women can grow in terms of number in parliament, in terms of number in banking, in terms of even women in development in general. So once respective countries are able to address these core issues that we just mentioned, then the rate of development, based on even the bank agenda 2063, then the fruitions that will come in the future will be more sustainable for the African country.
So I personally think one of the problem Africa has is food sustainability. And so if we had to speak to the agricultural sector in Africa, what impact has the AfDB, made in improving agricultural sector in Africa?
There are a lot of investment in that sector. I mentioned earlier the irrigation project that was done in Egypt, in the arid region of Egypt, that supplies irrigation to a lot of farmland, a mechanized farmland that was valued at billions of naira. So those improvements, in terms of even improvement on seedling, they had the cassava project some 8 years ago in Nigeria, particularly on the Oshu Axis, where that a lot of improvement was made. Like I mentioned earlier too, the government needs to improve on their funding, particularly in agriculture, particularly in the area of mechanized agriculture, rather than this subsistence level that has driven the process for a very long time. So once the right investments are made, and when you talk about transparency and accountability, government funding to that sector must be seen to be impacting the communities for which those funds are met, in addition to what the African Development Bank is doing in that sector.
Now, looking ahead into the prospects of the AfDB, I'm sure that there are many other projects that the bank would want to invest in or support in Africa, but funding is a critical issue. There's just as much as the bank can do. And one of the primary sources of funding for the bank, apart from the international partners that the bank has, is subscription from member countries. And we do know that some countries in Africa are battling these days with revenue, shortage of revenue. And the subscription is dependent on the size of the economy of the African country. Now, if part of what forms the funds that comes into the AfDB is subscription from its member countries, and some of them have limitations because of revenue, where does that put the AfDB at the end of the day in terms of future projects that it may want to get into and that it may need to support Africa with?
All right, let's begin this way. The 2063 agenda, first and foremost, is already an agenda that has been put in place. The funding that is required for the next, from the point where the initiative was taken to 2063, the elements in terms of financing and the projects in terms of futuristic planning, what we call perspective planning, that has been taken care of. Nevertheless, the issues of subscription, whether they are from international organizations, some international countries, and subscription from the 54 countries, that's on the one hand. The African development, again, has its own inbuilt mechanism. So when you give out development credits, you don't put them at the commercial rate like the banks. But then there are some rates that the bank gets from those credit portfolios that they give to specific countries. So they equally make some money. So those money that they make as well will be a percentage of their equity in terms of how they drive development project. But then there's a need for an overhaul after 60 years of existence. So some of the reforms should be reformed in the financial architecture to see how we can reduce the subscription from the global north in particular, and see how we can scale up the subscription from African country, irrespective of the challenge in terms of budget constraints, national budget constraints, so that the mandate or the agenda of the bank can be sustained in Africa. So we can make some reform in terms of the contribution, in terms of the credit, the extent to countries. You need to push up the percentage in terms of the repayment package. Then some other regional bodies within Africa, like the ECOWAS, SADC, that's the one representing South Africa, East Africa, and the Maghreb region, that's in Northern Africa, can come together to improve on those regional financing options so that they can collaborate with the African Development Bank to put the development agenda of Africa so that we can achieve the 2063 High Africa projects.
All right, the 79th United Nations General Assembly was held recently, and it's a platform that brings together world leaders to talk about global issues, climate issues, health issues, and of course, recently we've experienced the war in Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia that has also affected the supply of gas to some Western nations and in turn affected some other African countries, considering the fact that they're major exporters of certain agricultural produce. Now, these culminated in a decision, sustainable development. I mean, that's what everybody is talking about now. And that was arrived at the United Nations General Assembly. And if we had to, put Africa in perspective, of course, African leaders played a very key role in that particular gathering, trying to push their own narrative, foster relationship with Western counterparts. But then, if we had to put Africa in perspective, can the United Nations General Assembly agenda, blessing, these are the questions, improve Africa's situation? How can all of these collaborations in the end engender climate change, the fight to see if we could improve our climate, take away poverty, development generally? These are the key discussions, and I'm sure any African leader who would have gone there would have been trying to see if they could get something out of that. And if we had to, get you in, Mr. Sam, do you think that these sessions the outcomes can impact Africa's fight to stem climate change?
Thank you very much. I was smiling when you were making that contribution. Let me begin this way. Number one, the United Nations General Assembly is having the 79th session. The United Nations came into being with a charter in San Francisco, California, in 1945, October precisely, at the end of the Second World War, making an attempt to see how the ruins from the Second World War can be restored, nations. And the charter essentially is talking about global peace and security, disarmament, human rights issues. And recently, if you look at it from the Millennium Development Goal that are translated into the SDGs, the issue of climate change has become a burning issue. But then I describe the UNGA, which is a kind of diplomatic assemblage of world leaders where diplomacy is discussed. And more often than not, some of those contributions at the UN General Assembly do not translate into reality in terms of how we've been able to shape global peace and solidarity. We're not saying that the UN has not played this role, but at this particular point in time, if you look at it vis-a-vis Africa, has been trying to clamor for a permanent status for how many years, and that has not come true. And you look at the role of the Big Five in terms of how they shape global politics, then the UN as a body, where they meet 79 years on, the issues between Palestine and Israel is there. The war in Ukraine and Russia, they've not been able to use those instruments of the charter to be able to resolve conflict in some part of the world. But Africa in particular, in terms of our benefit, we go there, promises are made, and at the end of the day, if I answer you specifically in terms of climate change, the last conferences has dealt with climate change, and the promises in terms of climate financing, particularly to the global south, we're yet to see those deliverables shift. But in terms of a gathering that try to balance relationship in the global arena, the UN in the last 79 years has done remarkably well to some extent, but we need some reform in a way that some other countries, particularly minorities, issues of the climate change that you mentioned, the conflicts, the issue of disarmament and all that must be dealt with in a way that we can promote global peace and security.
Now, talking about reforms to ensure global peace, so there are other discussions at the UN 79, and there are discussions around strengthening multilateralism, cooperation amongst countries, and also having a global governance structure that fits the challenges of the 21st century. Now, to that, what is your take on it? You've talked about having more representation from the minority members of the UN. We do know that the UN Security Council has just 5 permanent members, and the others seem to be just ordinary members, so to speak. Now, what can be done if the aim or part of the issues that were discussed at this forum was to foster multilateralism, which seemed to be challenged right now in the world because of the conflicts ongoing here and there. And there's also a challenge with the global governance, which the UN represented before now, that when the UN speaks, other countries seem to be quiet and listen to what the UN is saying. When the UN imposes sanctions, it holds. And then the UN was like the government of the world. But now, because of the conflict that we're seeing, it's saying that structure is challenged. What would ensure cooperation and uphold that global governance structure to tackle these current challenges?
In the last 20 years or so, there's been clamor, even before the exit of the Ghanaian who passed Kofi Annan. There were attempts for major reforms at the UN, but the Global North has always been playing lip service or mouthing the kind of governance structure that can reshape the world governance. But one of the major impediments to that global structure in terms of the reform is the overbearing influence of the United States of America, where the financial architecture is centered around the dollar. And that has been major impediment to the restructuring. Thanks to the BRICS nation that are working so hard assiduously to see how that reform agenda in terms of some of these African bodies and other regional bodies and global bodies coming together to weaken the influence of the United States of America in terms of the global financial architecture that is tied to the UN system. So, but you are able to see how we can bring more people in terms of permanent representative, in terms of more people into the Security Council, so that we can have a balance in terms of the structure, the reporting structure. But then the West, with their kind of opaque diplomacy that you don't understand sometimes, it's difficult to see how we can change the fortune of global peace. But then other countries must find a way to constantly push their own agenda so that their voice can be heard. But beyond the General Assembly, you have other sidelines within that where businesses and some other things are discussed, not in the major General Assembly. So you have businesses that are discussed on the sideline, climate financing, PPP arrangement on the sideline. So let's see how that can play out for the development of the Global South in particular, where we belong.
From the many contributions or many worthy contributions that you just made, I'm going to pick two things. One of them is the dollarization of the financial system of the UN, which the BRICS seems to be challenging. But if the BRICS are able to challenge that in other systems, do you think that it would have success within the UN, given the constitution of the UN and for how long the dollar system has played paramount at the UN? And then for countries having representation or moving up into permanent membership, what do you think Africa should be doing in gearing up for a seat at the table?
First, you must put your house in order. African country in terms of corruption is a major impediment to some of those development. Number two, when you talk about the reforms, this is the 79th year of the United Nations with the global financial architecture that survived since October 1945. But then the most constant thing in life is change. So I'm hopeful, sincerely, that the BRICS nation are able to pull this agenda through so that the dominance of the United States in the global financial architecture will reduce to some extent. So I think that's one of the reforms. So, and I think more countries will key, whether the West like it or not, once some other country keys into that financial architecture and they're able to do their financial settlement or their transactions are done within those instruments, I'm sure that American will not be really happy about that. But if you look at the growing dominance of China in the global arena, America is already feeling threatened. If you look at the global trade between Africa and China, it has overtaken America in the last 10 years. So if you look at it from the point of view of international diplomacy and international politics, everybody will find a way to see that they are important at the international arena. But what is important, those other countries that the 5 hegemonic countries have pushed down for a very long while should be able to stand up in terms of doing a kind of realignment with other countries so that we can balance the system.
All right, Sam. Let me take it further. She had talked about eyeing a seat or getting a seat at the table. Feels like some of those Medieval movies where you have all the king sitting with his men at the table. But then beyond African leaders getting a seat at the table, do you think there will be a time when the world, global leaders, would look to Africa for some form of financial aid, contribution? Not just sitting at the table, but bringing something to the table in terms of the economic system.
Africa has always been bringing something to the table. The primary products of the world are domiciled in Africa. But the challenge is that we have continually taken those products as primary products to other part of the world for refining, for exploration and all that. And they come back to us at maybe 50% higher than the price at which they were taken away from Africa. So for an agenda to be at the table, that's on the one hand, but we need to have discipline back home and see how we can redirect our economic fortunes, particularly from the primary products that we have here, to see how we can mine those products, exploit those products, put them into finished products here. So those who want to take this product away, I think it's high time that we ask them to come back home to do investments here so that you take my cocoa to Switzerland. When your cocoa gets into Switzerland, is refined, then they come in form of chocolates. And so some of your friends, relations are coming from abroad. So you're asking, bring chocolate. Whereas the cocoa that brought about that chocolate is right in your backyard. So the point is that let's see how we can bring development, and we should not constantly look to the West to solve our problem. We can't process this. We have local industries that are processing some of the things, but in terms of the additives, in terms of standardization, which the West is trying to provide, who provide the standard? Who is the policing the global north in terms of what they call standards? So African countries and leaders and even citizens must look inward to see how we can patronize our own things and we improve over a period of time. And that's what China did. They closed their doors for so many years. And at the time they opened their door, the world became very uncomfortable with the level of development that has taken place in China. And the number of people that they have taken out of poverty in the last 20 years.
All right, talking about development, Africa using its primary resources for more development rather than just shipping them out, and then they are more value added to them, or they're processed and then re-imported to Africa and becomes very expensive. No, at the 79 UN General Assembly, leaders also discussed about the need for a global digital pact, which is to promote equitable access to technology. Now, would that pact also help Africa in having the right technology for its development? Do you see this coming through, or is it going to be like some of the climate fund pledges that never actually see the light of day, or some pacts that are there on paper, but in reality, we don't see them really making a difference?
Why is important that we must play at the global arena in terms of the UN General Assembly and the clamor for digital literacy and digital penetration in Africa? I think the African Union has a responsibility first and foremost to see how they can bridge this divide at a continental level. Why you draw a global attention to some of those needs, you need to be responsible back and see how you can drive that process. But then once you put your voice at the table, sometimes other development partners are able to provide some initiative that will help you to drive that process. But the responsibility to take it to another level behoves on African leaders to drive that process so that they can come to some level of speed with the global north. But then that speed leave much to be desired, because the volume of investment to drive that process may not be there first and foremost. Therefore, you go to the United Nations General Assembly to clamor for digital literacy and digital accessibility in terms of your access to digital infrastructure in Africa.
Well, let me just get on this before, because we're practically out of time. So one of the major issues in Africa is power, constant power. And taking a look at some of the news stories and reports emanating from, the United States on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, some governors met with Chinese investors to see if they can, attract those investments back home in the areas of power. Now, for me, I wonder, if we had to localize this, is it possible to have efficient, constant power supply, without the input of, the federal government?
This is a tricky question, but we make an attempt to answer it. Number one, each country has a responsibility to provide energy or power to its citizens.
Okay.
So that's a core responsibility, because government, first and foremost, is there to provide welfare and security for its citizens. So the point here is that a lot of our investment has been made in terms of driving power in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, but some of those investment has been filtered away by bureaucrats. But what can we do to think differently? Why there's a need for alternative energy stream?
Renewable energy.
Yeah, renewable energy. Quite instructive that we must go in that direction in terms of transitioning. But then those who are asking us to transition into alternative energy.
What do we even have?
No, they are making massive investment in the traditional mixed energy mix. You're talking about China still firing coal, even in Germany. And we have a great deposit of coal around the Enugu belt.
Yeah.
And nobody's talking about that. So those are sources of energy. Why they are encouraging us to transit? We should equally make investment, because they are equally making investment in those traditional means of energy. So we have to have a balanced energy source in a way that while they are encouraging us to transit, we should equally invest on the traditional means of energy so that we can power Africa for industrialization. And the African Development Bank that we mentioned much earlier in this conversation has an agenda for energy and power Africa 2063, which will bring energy to a greater majority of countries in Africa to a level of about 70% penetration, energy penetration by 2063.
So it's about each region doing what's best for it at the moment. Thank you so much, Samuel Orovwuje, who is a public and international affairs analyst. As we've looked at the African Development Bank at 60, the success they've achieved, the challenges and the prospects for the bank, as well as African economies. And we've also taken a look at the takeaways from the United Nations General Assembly, which has had its 79th session. Let's hope that more benefits will come to every nation that is connected to these institutions, and we'll see more development and peace across the globe. That's what we hope for, and that's what we preach here on SOUQ News TV.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.